Okay, this is session 10, and we're talking about motion and time and about framing. Motion and time are issues in design that involve a variety of approaches. There is time in a process. There is a development from concept to completion and delivery of a final piece, and motion is involved in basically the same thing, going from point A to point B to point C and so forth. Motion and time are intertwined. They both work together. Motion is a change in position that happens over time. So we recognize that something has moved, and time requires motion to recognize its passing. And we're very used to, the sun appearing to rise in the sky and traveling across the sky and then appearing to set because of the speed at which the Earth turns. And so motion and time are something that we are constantly dealing with and we're constantly aware of. Time is a duration, and a duration is a measured thing. We are not really aware of time unless we are measuring it, and a lot of us, as we are working, find we lose track of time because we're not watching the clock, and we have a sense of time slowing down if we are watching the clock, and things like that. So, but we're always looking for that movement on the clock face that shows that time has gone by. Both motion and time relate to the Gestalt principle of continuity, in which we are attracted to things that move, and we will prefer to move in one direction until we are compelled to change direction. In motion, there is static and dynamic understanding of the idea. Static would mean that nothing is moving, but the eye is moving through the design from point A to point B. And we get a sense that things have happened or are about to happen within a design contextually. And so we have a sense of something moving. Like we look at this photograph, and obviously all these little bits and pieces are suspended in midair, and we have a sense that something is in motion and has either been thrown up into the air or things are coming in and landing. But there is, even in this still image, there is a sense of something happening, something moving. The patterning that's created by the pieces of paper help create that sense of motion. The eye is drawn from one to the other. Then we also see a planar recession. There's a spatial depth that's going on as things are larger and in front of the things that are smaller and further behind. Something that is dynamic is something that actually moves. Any piece of animation or motion graphics or film, video is going to be dynamic. And basically the difference in the physical understanding of static and dynamic work is that in static work, the viewer's eye is doing the moving across the surface of the piece. In dynamic work, the viewer's eye might move, but not so much. It's actually the piece that's moving. Anticipated motion happens in a static work for the most part, and there's a sense of a perceived understanding that something is en route, changing position within the design space. And we understand this because we've seen people move, or we've seen things move, and so there is a state of suspense in which we are going from one balance point to the next, and it's in that changing from the one point to the next point that there's a sense of motion, a sense of things being maybe off balance until they land again. It creates a visual tension. In this painting, we have a giant passing through, and the sky seems pretty stormy, and there are clouds over the place, all over the place. There's gulls hanging in the air, kind of, as they often do. They just kind of hang static a little bit as they're flapping their wings. And each of the kids is in a state of suspended animation. They are starting to get up, starting to rise, starting to move out of curiosity of what's passing in front of their eyes. But if you'll notice, the giant is moving on a diagonal, and then there's a counteractive diagonal here. So there's a point of counterbalance, so that the forward motion is balanced by the other leg coming forward and also by the club over the shoulder. Then notice that the clouds are all on various diagonals, and most of the kids, if you look at the angle of their spines, are also on diagonals. Everything seems to be moving. We have a sense of wind, we have a sense of storminess, and we have a sense of surprise as this giant is walking through our field of vision. Kinetic motion relates to the dynamic idea, and kinetic motion is that which actually moves. And it usually means that it physically moves. If we're talking about a form, there is a kinetic understanding if something actually does move. Visually, we pick up that sense and watch movement across a TV screen or across the computer screen, and as things change from one thing into another. In static design, one of the ways that we create a sense of motion is through repetition. And that repetition can take the form of patterning, so that there's rhythm and cadence and value patterning. It can take the form of sequencing. It can take the form of just repeated forms. And as we look at the image of the pole vaulter, we see that there are repeated forms behind, and there is a strong sense of motion. There's also an anticipation going on here because the pole is bent in this state, and we know that before long it's going to spring straight and then wobble to the other curve, the opposite curve, and the vaulter is going to spring forward off of it. Another way to create the idea of motion in a static work is just by blurring things. There is a sense of movement that happens when you blur something, and we lose detail. We get a sense of, like in this piece, we get a sense of the drums being hit and the vibrations and so forth, simply because of the blurring of the surface pattern that's going on, but also because of the blurring of the figure. And then that's contrasted with the title of the book, which is not blurred. Another way to create motion is the idea of a multiple image. That every time we have more than one thing working together, we have a sense of something moving either from back to forward or forward to back. And even overlapping planes, planar recession, and getting smaller, there's a sense of going from larger to smaller. That means there's a movement. And if it's the same thing, the same object that's doing that, we definitely have that sense of changing position. If we look at this piece, we have a lot of strong diagonals as the geese are flying from the lower right to the upper left. And then we have the figure, the man standing there, in a very stable pose. He's very static. And then the contrast of the diagonals creates a greater sense of speed and motion on those birds. Nothing on the birds is blurred, so we know that they're not rising at warp speed, but they are all going diagonally, and they are all in suspended animation, their wings in various states of flight. And so the contrast between the static sense and the dynamic sense in this image is very striking, and we get a sense of, we're almost feeling the wings as they are feeling the wind that the wings are making as the birds are rising into the air. And talking about diagonals, diagonals will create a sense of energy and a sense of anticipated movement. And if we look at the poster, we're looking at nothing but diagonals. And even the type, although it is on a horizontal baseline, the type itself is oblique or italic, and therefore is in itself on a diagonal. So everything in here speaks to the idea of speed, speaks to the idea of movement. And this photograph of a picnic bench on some shore somewhere, taken when it's really windy and stormy and things are blowing and the water is all swirling and kind of boiling around. Again, the use of diagonals is very strong here. There's nothing here that in the photograph has been shot horizontal. Everything is on a diagonal, and that creates a greater sense of movement and of wind picking up, and even the blurring effects are done on a diagonal axis. This photograph obviously is showing a change from morning to night, and it's using the idea of multiple image. So not only do we have the sense of time passing from morning to night, but we do have a sense of motion as we're moving from the left to the right and back again across this bridge. And again, strong use of diagonals. There's some curves in here, things like that. But this is almost like a stop action camera sequence where we have bits of things pretty much almost every hour, and so it's been shot from a static position and then composited together, but we have a sense of movement and we have a sense of time passing. The use of curves helps create a strong sense of movement, and obviously in this there's nothing that's not moving, really. There's nothing that is not on a curve, so there's a lot of motion going on in here, and in some ways it's almost a sense of dizziness because it's so busy. This obviously is a retro 60s. There's a nod back to the design of the 1960s, but the sense of movement here is very compelling, and the only thing that's stationary is her face, her eyes, her nose, her mouth. When we're talking about time, there's a variety of ways that we can show the passage of time. When doing the information graphics piece, that project, the passage of time was very often shown in a linear fashion on a timeline, which is a standard way of showing that idea. With something like this, we have a sense of time being stopped almost. We have an understanding as we're looking at this scene. We've come upon it, and we're standing near this truck. We've got a dog, we've got a person over here, we've got some buildings, we've got a fairly deserted road, and we've got a car back over there. and to get from here to there is going to take some time to cover that distance. So just looking at this photo, we have a sense of not, well, some motion to get from foreground to background, but the amount of time it's going to take to get down to the end of the road. So creating distant using linear perspective and diminishment can help create a sense of time. Also, sequential imagery, such as this Edward Muybridge photo. He was actually the granddaddy of motion graphics and animation, and he set out to prove that a horse at a gallop actually is in flight. And so this is the result of that proof. And he did a variety of sequential images showing people in motion, animals in motion, and so forth. But the idea of one frame following on another like a storyboard in sequence, in order, creates a sense of time. It describes time, it depicts time, it demonstrates that time has passed. And we do this also in panel cartoons, where we are creating a story and setting up the beginning, the middle, and the end, and then using the idea of various panels to show various snippets of conversation, various activities, and so forth that take place over time. And of course, this piece is appropriate because it's actually talking about time. Another way to depict time, I've already mentioned, is the timeline, or the idea of linear movement. And again, that relates to the Gestalt idea of continuity, where we will follow in a particular direction, and when we go in a direction, we're following a line, a path, and so forth. So if we look at the cartoon character here, first of all, he's setting up, and notice the repeated image that's going on here, where his feet are basically, parts of his feet are being restated over and over again to get that sense of he's building up speed, and all of a sudden he's launching and there's a straight linear path. So he is on an implied line. So the linear movement, of course, does not have to be on an actual inscribed line. It can be on an implied line, as is going on here. Another way to depict time passing is the idea of showing things that are in change mode, or they're metamorphosing. They are becoming, they start as one thing and become another. You know, a plant growing, an infant becoming an adult, a puppy becoming a full-blown, dog. Those things all, we know, take time, and as we go from one state into another, we undergo a change, and the change happens over time. And so animation picks that up pretty easily. We have the idea of change in form as it's depicting a camera pullback, and there's a change in position, and we eventually find out it's this sort of funky hat and this figure walking off into the distance. So we come very close up on the figure and then start pulling back and getting some facial shots in here. We're kind of rotating around, and then we're coming back to the hat again, and the hat gets smaller in the frame, so we see more of the figure, and there's the figure walking off into the sunset. And that is a change. It's showing a change in position. It's showing basically a change in the parts of the forms that we're looking at. Framing is basically, well, it's related to the idea of open composition or closed composition. And the same thing put in a closed situation will read differently than something that is in an open composition. Most of the time we frame things as designers. We frame things with white space, we frame things with other elements. There are obvious places within any design space, given all the elements that are involved, where things should go, and other things will act as a framing device to highlight or showcase. And the most basic ideas of framing are whether or not you have a margin, whether or not you have a full bleed, which is where the image takes up the entire design space and seems to continue off, so certain things are cropped. Or there's a partial bleed, such as this. So this is a closed composition, this is open, and this is partially closed or partially open, however you want to look at that. It's bleeding on the two sides and the top, but not on the bottom. So the same image framed differently for different purposes. Framing is a very important or idea, principle, given the context that you're working in. This book cover is the overall full bleed, and the sky is the framing device for all the type. And so everything reads comfortably off of the lighter ground of the sky. And then the dust cloud and the car and the road is basically a support mechanism that helps also frame the overall idea. Another book cover using framing in a different way. The type is the framing device itself, and the figure becomes the important thing. The type is buttered up against the edge and buttered up against the edge here, and it's kind of squeezed together up in here, and basically it's wrapping all the way around the figure. So now the type is being used to frame the figure. And then we have this inset, this bar of color, this large rectangle, in which we have the author's signature and basically the lead-in comment to the book, most famous piece of science fiction ever. So the signature is framed, and this tagline is framed, the image is framed by the type. And so there's different ways of framing in this as opposed to this. It's another book cover, and obviously the framing of the title and the author's name is very strategically placed. That's not just slapped on there, it's quite deliberate. And also the the buildings, the city becoming the fangs of the tiger is also an interesting concept, and using that to help frame this idea. Notice how the animal, the tiger itself, is cropped in the picture plane. We have very little showing of the animal except for the fangs and the open mouth. And so we have the suggestion of the rest of the animal because of the cropping, but notice how up close and personal this gets because of how the animal itself is framed. This is not a far away shot. This is a very close up, in your face, and hear how it relates to you because we've got a cityscape going on. And so this is a real strategically designed cover. Fairly simple, but still very potent in what it's trying to express. We also see framing a lot in logos, and some logos don't get framed, others do. Some come with frames, others don't. I found two logos that are related because they use a hand-drawn script, and they're both really well known. And one of them sits within an oval framing, and we have not just one frame but several layers of framing on this, and it supports the action of the type itself, and you don't see the word Ford relating to the car without its framing device. Coca-Cola, on the other hand, is unframed, and it in itself would be then framed by a white space, and gives this a certain sense of versatility. Once in a while you see this framed on, like there's the old round red buttons with the Coke bottle and the word Coca-Cola reversed out in white, so that would become a framing device. But this just goes to illustrate the idea of framing within a logo design and the lack of it. By the way, the registered trademark, that's framed. The R is framed by the circle. So let's take a few moments to review. So what is your understanding of these terms? Non-objective form, hieratic scaling, negative shape, a value key, serial design, color constancy, design itself, and equivocal space. Non-objective form are those shapes and forms that don't represent something. They are more than abstract. They would be geometrics and some random forms. They can be curvilinear, rectilinear, irregular, but they don't actually try to represent something that actually exists. Hieratic scaling is increasing the size of something due to importance. So a lot of Middle Eastern illuminated manuscripts, early Western European illuminated manuscripts, Egyptian hieroglyphic depictions all used hieratic scaling. We use it a lot in movie posters and entertainment design. Negative shape are those negative spaces that are actually surrounded by positive shape, and therefore it's a defined shape, but it's a void or it's negative. Value key is the overall lightness or darkness of an image. As we look at the Klimt painting, we have a dark value, we have a lot of light values, but the overall key is landing in the middle value range. If we translated this into a grayscale, it would be mostly middle value grays. Serial design is design that's done in a series. A lot of brand products have line extensions that are a series of the same thing, but with slight differences from one to the other. Color constancy is the idea that under any given lighting source we're still able to determine the color, the accurate color of an object. And the book describes it. The book describes it basically on the idea of Gestalt assimilation principle. But the reality is that because our eyes measure wavelengths, a blue object is always going to reflect more wavelengths than more blue wavelengths than a green object. So even under a red light, we will see more blue on the blue object than we will on the green object. And so the visual difference will be able to be discerned, and you can pick the blue from the green. A camera does not see that way. That's what the human eye does, because the human eye measures wavelength proportions or reflectance ratios. A camera does not. So if you take a photograph of those two objects in that red light situation, they're going to appear red. Design is the planned arrangements of elements within a given space. An equivocal space is figure ground ambiguity. Bilateral symmetry and an axis, module, eye level, value pattern, and the type of balance that's in this photo. Bilateral symmetry is basically the idea of a vertical axis and things happening the same on one side as the other side of that axis. An axis, of course, is a balance point. It's a directional pull off of a balancing fulcrum. A module is any form that's repeated within a design. Structures are made up of small modules because we've taken a space and we've divided it into subdivisions or smaller spaces, and so each one of those spaces is a module. Eye level is the distance from the ground plane to your eyeballs. Eye level is not the horizon. The horizon is usually seen when you can see it at eye level, but the horizon does not define what eye level is. If you stand up on a ladder and look, you increase your eye level, you raise your eye level. If you lie down on the ground, you severely lower it, and so eye level relates to you as the viewer. In the case of this photograph is taken at the eye level of the photographer. And the question would be then, is this taken at the subject's eye level? And the answer is no. The subject is actually higher, on higher ground than the photographer. So in other words, we're looking up at Johnny Cash, and eye level is right here. So he's being created to look somewhat monumental, and especially with the triangularity of his pose, and then the two dogs flanking in a triangle, a pyramid idea. So we have stability and monumentality working just in how this is composed. But we are actually looking up at Johnny Cash, who was looking down at the photographer. The photographer the camera is lower than Johnny Cash's eye level. And when we address any photo or any illustration like this, we will be addressing it at the photographer's or the artist's eye level. Value pattern is the repeated light, dark, light, dark, light, dark sequencing that happens in a design space. We get value pattern within the reeds, we get value pattern within the clouds, we get value pattern on the ground plane, because we have areas that are dark and next to areas that are light. And we recognize pattern mostly because of change in value. And the type of balance in this photo is approximate symmetry. So what is a symbol? What's gestalt? What is tonality or color dominance? What kind of space does this represent? What's proximity? and what is subject. A symbol is something that represents something else, whether it's another object, a group of things, an idea. If you are in the LA area, the crisscrossed LA, the white LA on the field of blue represents the Dodgers as a team, represents baseball as a sport, and so forth. So those become symbols. We use the little symmetrical heart symbol for love. And do you see any symbols in this design? Depends upon what the book is representing. This is about reading, and it's about growing through reading, so the book is actually representing reading. Gestalt, of course, is the idea of wholeness and completeness, that everything within a design, within a form, works together to express the entirety of the form or the design. Tonality kind of relates to value key, but it actually deals in a more broader sense, because value key is a type of tonality. Color dominance is the other idea. The tonality of this is it's achromatic. There's no chroma in it. It's all black, white, and gray. It is low key. It is more dark than it is light, but it's high contrast. And tonality, basically, the black is just basically expressing the idea. Most of the time when we're reading black letters on a white page. And so the tonality in this design helps relate to that visual understanding of basically the color of reading black on white, and black being a color of substance and even of authority in Western culture. There is a sense of seriousness about what this poster is expressing. The spatial understanding here is decorative or flat space. It's not volumetric illusion. Proximity is used. We have the letter forms and the book coming together. And notice there's also an implied line that helps unite them, tie them together. That common angle there. Then this, of course, becomes an opposing angle to counterbalance. And then this is leading right down to here. And this little group is also proximal to itself, or to the pieces within itself, but not to this. So proximity is used. The subject of this is reading. Critique is the evaluation of a work for the purpose of defining its strengths and weaknesses. Most products, before they're put on the market, go through a testing. And they're tested for soundness, they're tested for functionality, they're tested for capability, things like that. That's basically a kind of critique. And so the idea of critique is that it's something that you would do from start to finish within your design process. It should be incorporated into your design process so you don't get off track in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. So critique is an evaluation of something to point out its strengths and weaknesses for the purpose of basically improvement and increasing ability. Integration is in volumetric illusion, or there's figure ground understanding within decorative space. Integration would say that the ground is actually merging with the figure at some points, and you will have lost contour or lost boundaries. Horizontal balance is any kind of balance that uses a horizontal axis. Usually with symmetrical balance, it's going to divide the image in half, or the design space in half vertically, so you have a top half and a bottom half. And the after image, of course, is the visual effect of seeing the complementary hue after you've been looking at something that has a particular color. And it is caused by the fatiguing of the rods and cone cells in the eye as you're looking at something. And then when you look away, it takes a few moments for the cells to kind of regroup. And so we have the after image.